Well, good morning. Welcome back to our Bible study here at Prince of Peace Lutheran Church in Spring Lake Park, Minnesota. We have a wonderful morning this morning. If you're not in Minnesota, our temperatures are, around 60, 62, perfect. A wonderful night for sleeping last night. We could actually have our windows open, which was great. After wait, this isn't a weather forecast, it's a Bible study. It is, but we're very happy when the weather changes, and we were dealing with such difficult temperatures this week and high humidities and all of that. So very happy. Hey, happy Father's Day to all you fathers out there who are watching, and hope you have a wonderful day. And the gift of fatherhood, wow. We could go all morning on that one, but hope you have a wonderful time with your family and you hear from your kids, and you are reminded of the blessing that you are, the blessing of fathers. What a wonderful, wonderful blessing it is. So, around Father's Day, we certainly think about our Heavenly Father and the idea that we can call Him Daddy, which is interesting, Abba, Father. And that still is so profound. It's a difficult thing for us to grasp. So it's something to think about here on Father's Day. We are here, Matthew 27:50. We're coming to the end of the Gospel of Matthew, and we haven't decided where we're going to go when we get to the end, but got some ideas. And we'll finish up strong here in Matthew. And last week, of course, we ended with 49. Let's see if Elijah will come. And we talked about Elijah, and we talked about the musical set to this Elijah. I just saw a man named Elijah. The Passover liturgy set to the songs of West Side Story. Google it; it's there. And Jesus cried out again. This is verse 50. And Jesus cried out with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. There's this whole argument. Well, Jesus was killed, Jesus was murdered, Jesus was crucified, of course, but the question is whether or not Jesus, it's a subtle point, but an important one. Jesus tells us He lays down His life and He takes it up again. He lays down His life and He takes it up again. So is He still in control of the situation? Yes, He is. And ultimately, His death is something which He allows to happen. And that's just something you'll have to write a big book about. And I think a guy by the name of Karl Rahner, a Roman Catholic theologian, Karl Rahner, if I remember, that's deep track back in the brain there, talked about that. Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up His spirit. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. Now, when the temple curtain was split in top from bottom, what they're talking about is the curtain between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. Very, very important. I think in the latest movie about this period, maybe it was AD or something, it came out a few years ago. It started strong and then it just faltered. But they actually showed the temple curtain being ripped in that film. I think that's the first time I've seen that. But here's the Holy of Holies and the holy place. So we'll call this HP and we'll call this HH, Holy of Holies, and curtain here. And this is where the lampstands were, the 7 lampstands and the altar of incense and the table of showbread. And of course outside is where the actual slaughtering and the sacrifice would take place. And then in the morning and the evening the priest would go in, and not just all the Levites, just the priests would go in, and they'd put parts of the sacrifice mixed with incense on this altar. It smelled really good. I've talked about this before, and that is, it must have smelled incredibly good around the temple in Jerusalem, because they're always cooking beef, and they're always cooking lamb and goat, and it must have been extremely good. And you're like, well, no, they just burnt. No, actually, they would cook it, and who got to eat it then when they were done cooking? The families of the Levites, the families of the priests. So as you went to the temple in Jerusalem, and it makes sense, it was a pleasing aroma. It wasn't like burning trash, where you have, when you go to African countries, they burn trash beside the road. It wasn't like that. And my childhood was that way. Because I didn't grow up in Africa, but I grew up in western Nebraska. And we had burn barrels behind the house in the alley. And the way you took care of your trash is you went and you dumped it in the burn barrel. It was a 60-gallon oil barrel, and you set it on fire. One of my jobs as a kid was to set the trash on fire. And it was a great job. I loved doing that. I could take the trash out and then throw matches in and watch it. But everybody did in the neighborhood. And we had a lady in our neighborhood that went around with a petition. She wanted everybody to sign it that we wouldn't burn our trash on the days that she put her laundry out. Well, I think about that now, if everybody went out and burned their trash. But here at the church, which was built in 1959, 60, right in there was an incinerator when I first got here. And they used to burn all their trash here at the church and at the school in the incinerator, right in the middle of the school. They'd put it in there, set it on fire. All the trash would go up in smoke. Literally. Big stink. Here it smelled really good. Now, this is the curtain that's ripped in two. But when the curtain is ripped in two, what should have been exposed, of course, was the Ark of the Covenant. But it wasn't there. It was gone. It was long gone. Nobody knows where it went to. Okay, that's Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's what that film's about. If I remember right, Prophet Jeremiah, the legend is Prophet Jeremiah took it out of Jerusalem and hid it somewhere before the Babylonians came, and hasn't been seen since. Now, there's that place in Africa where they claim it's in that building. Is it Ethiopia? You can Google it. But they claim that it's in this building. And there's one guy that lives in the building his entire life. And no one's allowed in except for that one guy. And they claim it's there. They claim it's in that building. But it wasn't here. And so when the temple ripped in two, or when the curtain ripped in two, it exposed the Holy of Holies. And thus it says, okay, we're all done with this. We're all done with the temple. The only person who could go back to the Holy of Holies was the high priest on the Day of Atonement. That was the only time anybody ever went back there. The altar guild was not allowed back there. Nobody was allowed back there, except for the high priest on the Day of Atonement. And I've speculated as well that, after years and years and years of the high priest going and throwing blood on this must have looked pretty bad. If every year the high priest would go back and throw blood on what did it look like after years and years and years and years and years of people throwing blood on it and the blood drying on it? It's an interesting question, I think. This was also known as the mercy seat, okay? And you also had the angels, just like in the film, but perhaps not exactly like in the film. So, curtain, gone. Exposing the system and saying, ultimately, no, this system is not going to be in place anymore. Okay, that's what's happening here. This happens when Christ dies. Interesting. The earth shook, rocks were split, tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. One of the more interesting passages, one of the most interesting, they're all interesting, the most interesting passage in Scripture, one of them, that when Christ dies in the cross, graves open and people rise from the dead. It's interesting. It's almost like the plants that grow up out of the ground when it rains. We get these torrential rains here. And I'm always fascinated by them growing up out west. Rain's gone. Colorado had this really cool thing that would happen. Rain would fall out of the sky, but it would evaporate before it hit the ground. And so there were times where you could actually see the droplets of rain falling out of the clouds if the light was just right. But the rain wouldn't hit the ground. It would evaporate before it would even hit the ground. It happens every once in a while still out there. It's an amazing thing to see. But here, of course, we just had this torrential rain this week. And then you go out, and these bare spots are full of weeds, and they're full of plants. They just boom out of nowhere, and that's when they come rushing out of the cracks in your driveway and in the street. And it's almost like that, the death of Christ. It's like the ultimate sacrifice for mankind, for the sin of mankind, has been made. God has died, we could say. And creation can't be stopped. the reaction has to be the earth quaking and bodies rising again from the dead. It's an interesting idea. We don't really have much more on it in Scripture than that, okay? And you could say, well, how strange is that? Well, I mean, Christ was raising people from the dead. We know he raised at least, the widow of Nain and Lazarus and the centurion's, the leader's daughter. Was it the Jewish leader's daughter? And, the centurion's servant. But at least 3, and there has to be many, 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 many more. So it was a normal thing. So, the creation itself responds to the crucifixion. Entered the holiest city and appeared to many. So after his resurrection, they entered the holy city. And so you have, and I've never seen that in a movie. I've never seen the resurrection where Christ appears to his disciples in the upper room, but the people who had died also appear. They also appeared to people in Jerusalem. Wow. That's interesting. So mind-blowing, actually, that we should probably just all cross it out because we can't understand it. That's what modern scholars do, right? And that's what Christians do, too. Anything uncomfortable in the Bible, they just ignore. And they don't try to figure out how it all fits together, which they should. But think of it like that. The rain comes down, and the plants just go boom. Christ dies on the cross for the sins of the world. And the people who have died, boom, they rise again from the dead. It's interesting, isn't it? Because this would also be how we could explain the miracles that Christ did and the miracles that the apostles did, but then the miracles that we don't do, right? Because a lot of people will say, well, if you're a Christian or if you're truly Spirit-filled, you can do these miracles today. You can, I don't know if anybody raising the dead nowadays. You can heal, you can do this. But a counter-argument is no, that was done, of course, around Christ and then the apostles, and the further away we get from Christ, the less we see that. Kind of like Christ is the big explosion, and then the fallout, and then after that, you don't have things going on like that. Well, here would be a good example. In the resurrection, Christ dies on the cross, people rise from the dead, and they appear. But that doesn't happen again. It doesn't happen when we go out to the cemetery and we bury a pious Christian, that suddenly people rise again from the dead. Why? Because it was a one-time event in the history of the world with one-time consequences. And so to say, well, if you're a Christian, you have to be able to do all these things just like the apostles and just like Jesus. No. We have to give a historic meaning to that event. And certainly this does, doesn't it? That you have people rising from the dead and appearing in Jerusalem to others. That's interesting. That gives us something to think about, doesn't it? Now, here's John Wayne, verse 54. Now the centurion and those who were with him keeping guard over Jesus when they saw the earthquake and the things that were happening became very frightened and said, truly this was the Son of God. You remember in the Jesus movie, that was the only line John Wayne had in the movie. So we say that's the John Wayne. They're smarter than the Pharisees. They're smarter than the Sadducees. Think about that. The pagans look around and they see what's happening and they say, oh, it must be of divine origin. The Jews look around and say, matter of just chance that this all happened at this time. But the pagans look around and they rightly conclude this was the Son of God. Now you say, and I brought this up before, what was the emperor called at that time? The emperor in Rome was called the Son of God. Remember, was it Julius Caesar or the Caesar before Augustus Caesar, who was the first one to claim divine status after his death? It's, that's that whole thing I mean, we're so strange, and in many ways, we're so odd. But we have July and August because of those Roman emperors. We do. We have July and August, and then for the ninth month, what do we call it? The ninth month, we call it the seventh month, September. And the 10th month, we call it the 8th month, October. And the 11th month, we call November, 9th month. And the 12th month, we call December. Think about that. How silly is it that we call month 7, 8, 9, 10, month 9, 10, 11, and 12? Because Augustus Caesar wanted a month to himself, and Julius Caesar wanted a month to himself. And that's why we have June, and then July, August, and then September, which means 7. Ha! And we go blithely along, not knowing any of these things. Oh, yeah. Many women were looking on from a distance who had followed Jesus from Galilee while ministering to him. Among them was Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Okay, so we have the moms thereby. And knowing, of course, we always think that it's like the 12 apostles following Jesus around, like a 13-car train going around. But in reality, Jesus had a whole mob of people around him. Remember, he doesn't just send out the 12, he sends out the 70. And after the resurrection, it's about 100 people who are gathered together. 100 people. So yes, he takes 12 and he calls them apostles, ambassadors. But there was dozens and dozens of disciples, men and women around Jesus following him. So a whole community of people following him at that time. And here were some of them there by the cross, looking from a distance. I mean, it's dark. It's interesting with all the technology that we have today. We have a crowd of people. You know, we've had all these protests and riots, and you have crowds of people, and yet we still have a difficult time identifying people, right? Even though we have cameras there, and we have street cameras, and we have satellites, and we have all these different things, and there's street lights even. And here in the time of Jesus, there's none of that. So a person could remain anonymous at a distance at an event like this, and nobody would know. All right? So, verse 57, when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock. And he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb and went away. And Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary sitting opposite the grave. Okay, this gives us our details. How did Jesus get in the grave? What happened to Jesus? Who put him there? How could he be in a grave if he was this pauper from Galilee with no income, so to speak? How would he end up? Otherwise, what would you do with a body like that? We talked about the place of the skull. Maybe they would just leave it. Maybe they would just leave it. Just throw it in a pile. You know, it used to be very common. Well, it is still common. It used to be common for cities to have these pits that they would bury poor people in. And when poor people would die, they'd throw them in the pit, and when the pit was full enough, they would just cover it with dirt and move on. Mozart, the composer, was thrown in a pit like that, oddly enough, because I think he was in incredible debt when he died, and he died young. If he would have lived longer, he probably would have worked himself out of debt with the music that he was creating. But he was thrown in a pit like that. Where was I going with this? There was a point to... Oh, yes. Today, we have this thing called cremation, and one of the things that happens with cremations, well, two things happen. A family will have a relative cremated, but then they will not inter the urn. That is, either put it in an existing vault in the ground or put it in a vault in a place specifically for that. Or, and this is happening more and more, the family just leaves it at the funeral home. And so every funeral home has a room, and in the room there's these boxes of people's ashes. And after a certain length of time, they take the ashes out, like 6 months or a year, I forget what the law is. But they take the ashes out and they pour them in a place of ground, a little plot of ground at the cemetery, which is just for that. And that's what happens to the remains of those people. So I think probably in every major cemetery they have this little tiny plot of ground, which is just for the remains that have been cremated that the family has not taken. So that's pretty much exactly like what we have with common graves. That used to be what would happen. But this is not what happens to Jesus. And this explains why Jesus had a grave, and a very nice one, because Joseph of Arimathea had become a disciple of Jesus and placed Jesus in his own tomb. Okay? Now the way that worked back then, of course, is they would place someone in a tomb like that and let the body decay for about a year until they could go in and they would just find the bones there. And they would take the bones, put them in a box, label the box, and put them on a shelf in the tomb. It would become the family tomb. So there'd be lots of little holes in the side of the wall. This is from archaeology. And you'd have your family members all in the same tomb. But the tomb itself would be used just for that purpose, to let the body decay and not have it taken away by wild animals or anything like that, which is I mean, we still have these issues today that we have always had. Now the next day, the day after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, the deceiver said, 'After 3 days I am to rise again.'" Now see, there is the killer right there, verse 63. Because here just a chapter or two ago, they're saying, aha! He's saying he's going to destroy the temple. We can't have somebody saying that. But they knew what he meant. They knew that Jesus was teaching and preaching that he would rise again from the dead after 3 days. Now, you would say, well, no, that was just something the disciples believed, but the disciples didn't even understand that. That was something later that the Christians learned. No, here, the people who knew, the intelligentsia among the Jews, we could say, the chief priests and the Pharisees, they knew exactly what Jesus was preaching. That even though he was going to be crucified, that he would rise again from the dead after 3 days. And that makes complete sense because he was raising people from the dead. And they knew he was teaching this. So for modern people to say, the disciples didn't understand, well, yeah, they were in the dark. They wanted Jesus to be a king. But then later on, the whole resurrection thing, no. Jesus taught the resurrection from the dead. And the way you know somebody teaches something sometimes is by reading what the adversaries of that person write. And then you know what he was teaching, because if the adversaries write it, so they're the ones that go to Pilate. Remember that when he was still alive, the deceiver said, "After 3 days I am to rise again. Therefore give orders for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day." So those soldiers were only supposed to stay there for 3 days. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal him away and say to the people, "He has risen from the dead," and the last deception will be worse from the first. Now, this is, we could say, the Jewish gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, written traditionally for the Christians in Jerusalem. And here they're talking about the resurrection from the dead, 3 days after the crucifixion. And that it was understood that this was so, that this is what Jesus taught. So what does Pilate said? You have a guard. Go and make it as secure as you know how. And they went and made the grave secure, and along with the guard they set a seal on the stone. So who's doing this? Are the Romans doing this? No. It's the Jewish temple guards who are doing this. The little police force of the temple. So, and these are the same guys that came out to arrest Jesus. It wasn't the Romans doing that. It was Jews doing that. And here Pilate says, use your own police force to go do it. Now that kind of puts a different spin on the story, doesn't it? In the sense that, I think a lot of times you see the depiction of Roman soldiers standing there next to the grave. Well, here it's the temple guard that's standing next to the grave. Rome doesn't care. Rome's like, and you imagine by this time Pilate's like, really, guys, you got everything you wanted. You just go do what you want. He's dead. And my wife's all upset. And I'm probably in trouble politically. And you're worried about this? Go do it yourself. So, interesting stuff, isn't it? Okay. Nine o'clock, right? Now after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. Behold, a severe earthquake had occurred, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone and sat upon it. Another idea is that Jesus kind of broke out of the grave himself. I've heard that a couple of times. Jesus rolled his own stone away. He got up, stretched, and out he came. No. Jesus doesn't have to roll the stone away in order for him to rise from the dead. He passes through the stone. What's the first thing he does when he's raised from the dead? He descends into hell and proclaims to the captives there that he has indeed rose from the dead. Rise, raise, rose, risen. Risen? He's risen. So the angel, when he descends to open the tomb, is just doing it to show the world that this is so. Look, he's risen from the dead. He's not here. It's not Jesus waking up and saying, how do I get out of this? And out he walks. No, that's not what happens. Okay? Now that can be kind of challenging for us. And we're like, well, wait a second, how does he get out? Well, here we have to think, right? So now he's raised from the dead. He's not always going to be visible and tangible to his disciples, right? He appears, disappears, appears, disappears, appears, disappears, appears, disappears, right? Shows up in the upper room, disappears. Okay? And shows up on the road to Emmaus and talks with the guys, and then in the breaking of the bread, he disappears. Okay? And let's not get, I've said this before, let's not get hung up on this. Let's not get hung up on the appearance of Christ or the disappearance of Christ. I always think it's so weird that people have a problem with this, but then they'll go and watch these ghost movies, or they'll go and watch these movies about spirits, or they'll go and they'll believe everything. Oh yeah, once happens, and then you're just the undead, and you're walking around like this because that's real and that's true. And then of course that became boring, and so then zombies could run. Well, how can zombies run? That's still a problem for me. But we believe all that idiocy. And then Jesus disappeared, and then he reappeared, and that can't be real. It's just, that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So you have this one wing of Christianity that says when Jesus appears in the upper room, he doesn't really appear in the upper room. He sneaks in through a door that they forgot to lock, or he comes through a window that they forgot to close. because Jesus can't appear and disappear at will after the resurrection. And you know why they're arguing that? They're arguing it because if it's true, then where else can Christ appear with his body and his blood? You're right. In the Lord's Supper. Aha. So tied together with this idea of the resurrection of Christ from the dead and his ability to appear and disappear and be in this place and that place is also the ability of Christ to be present in the Lord's Supper with his body and blood to this day. And what does Christ say? Where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst of them. Well, we got 1, 2, 3, and I saw Melissa around here. We've got 4. So we've met the criteria. So we can say he's here in the midst. Well, he is. He's promised to be. So he is. So there you have it. Well, you can't see him, Pastor. You're right. But I believe he's here. And that certainly is what Christian faith is, right? Believing the things that we can't see. But he's promised to be here, so he is here. And that's a wonderful thing. That's an awesome thing. We believe all these other things, but we won't believe that. And then we believe the silly things we hear on the news, the crazy things we hear on the news. And the difference is we want to believe those things. We want to believe those things. Our old Adam wants to believe those things. And that's why they're more tangible for us than the presence of Christ with us yet today. Right? I was thinking, kids' songs are really good. I sang a lot of kids' songs when I was in church growing up. And the problem with kids' songs is when churches continue to have older and older kids sing kids' songs. That's the problem, right? As kids get older, they should sing more complex songs, introducing more difficult concepts and ideas, just like education, right? We don't come to the high school lit class, college prep, and, okay, take out your books. Okay, read the first sentence there, Bill. See Jane run. Run, Jane, run. Oh, very nicely done, Bill. Mary, you want to take the next one? Yes. See Spot bark. Bark, Spot, bark. Oh, you guys are doing so well today. You are doing so. You're really going to ace your ACT and your SATs because you're doing so well. And when we do that theologically with children, of course, we don't prepare them to deal with the theological complexities of the world. But the nice thing about kids' songs is they teach children the basics of the Christian faith. Of course, if they're theologically sound, that's what we want. But I remember we used to sing this one, "The angel rolled the stone away." The angel rolled the stone away. And that's all we needed to sing. The angel, so the rest of my life, I could think, well, wait a second, that's not how the song goes. The song doesn't say Jesus rolled the stone away. The song doesn't say the soldiers rolled the stone away. It says the angel rolled the stone away. So if I can remember that one, great. Of course, the other one we used to sing all the time, somewhere in outer space, God has prepared a place. That was back in the late 60s, early 70s. Everybody was into space back then, Apollo moonshots and that sort of thing. We can talk about that one, all right? Somewhere in outer space, God has prepared a place. Remember that one? No? Must have just been a Western song that we sang. I don't know. Okay. His appearance was like lightning and his clothing as white as snow. The guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men. The angel said to the woman, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who has been crucified. He's not here. He is risen, just as he said. Come see the place where he was lying. Go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And behold, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Behold, I have told you." Sang a piece in college by Francis Poulenc, and that's all the line was. Go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead. That's all the piece was. So we sang that again and again and again and again and again. Go quickly. But you remember that. Questions here. It's interesting that God sends an angel And remember, the term angel means messenger. And I wish, if we had a translation that says, God sent a messenger. He's supposed to deliver a message. The angels show up and they talk. He proclaims the resurrection of the dead, and he tells the Marys how they're supposed to understand what they're seeing. Here you're seeing this. Okay, what do you see? Well, let's see. I see an empty tomb. I see a stone rolled away. I see a couple soldiers there, a couple guards who are lying as dead men. Don't understand, angel. Tell me what it means. It means that Christ has been raised from the dead. Christ has risen from the dead. Could we say that insofar as he's man, Christ is raised from the dead? And then insofar as he's God, he raises himself from the dead? I think we have to say that because in Acts, Paul says God raised him from the dead, right? In the Acts 17 sermon. That's what he says. But Christ says, I lay my life down and I take it back up again. He says that as well. Don't be afraid. I know that you're looking for Jesus who has been crucified. He's not here. He's risen. The angel has to come and tell them. It's amazing. We need that all the time, right? We need, when big events happen in our lives, we have to have people tell us what they mean. Because we look at it, and a lot of time we can't understand when we see something that has happened. And we look at it and we go, wow, what does that mean? And then somebody has to tell us, and we're like, oh, okay. That's what happens. That's what happens. That's what all this stuff means that I'm looking at. Come see. I just thought of children and messes. What happened here? I mean, a lot of times you can deduce it by looking at the mess and where all the stuff has fallen and all that, but every once in a while you have to have an explanation. How did that happen, right? We say that. How did that happen? Well, funny thing, an alien landed and came through the kitchen, was trying to get the cookies off. Go quickly and tell his disciples that he's risen from the dead, and behold, he's going ahead of you into Galilee, and there you will see him. Behold, I have told you. It's an interesting thing, too, right, that they go to Galilee to find Jesus. He said, I'll find you there, and that's where so they end up in Galilee, right, which is kind of an interesting thing, away from Jerusalem. Away from Jerusalem. Who's the one that ascends into heaven from Jerusalem? Dun, 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 dun. It's Muhammad, right? But he doesn't really ascend into heaven. He has a vision of his ascension into heaven, right? And that's why they have the Dome of the Rock there in Jerusalem. But Jesus doesn't ascend from Jerusalem. That's an interesting point. Thank you. He's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Behold, I have told you. Why is Christianity all about going someplace and listening? I've kicked this one to death. Because Christianity is all about speaking the words of God and hearing the words of God and listening to the words of God. It's not about coming to have an ethereal experience, to experience God, which is interesting. You know, if God wanted us to have this gigantic experience and that was how we were to relate to him, what would Jesus have done? I mean, it's an interesting thing. It really is. We have a church here in town that's into that. And when they're in our parade, what they do is they have a guy spinning records as he's on the back of a snowmobile trailer, because snowmobile trailers can be used for like a million things. I didn't know that until I lived in Minnesota, but you can use a snowmobile trailer for almost anything, it seems. But he's got a record player, and he's spinning discs. He's got the microphone like me, and behind the trailer, he's got a bunch of dancing people. Now, this is supposed to convey Christianity to the world. That what Christianity is all about is dancing down the street to a disco type of discotheque or whatever they call them now. What do you call a dance place now? What do they call? Do you know, nightclub? Okay. So Christianity is like being at a nightclub. Now, if this is Christianity, what should Jesus have done when he showed up here on earth? Thrown parties? Played a flute? Played a harp? Got together and had massive worship events? No. He did a strange thing. He talked to people. He talked to them. He taught them. He told them. And the angel shows up, and he's got the white clothes, and he shines like lightning, and he doesn't start zapping things like some superhero. He talks to them. And if anyone you love stops talking to you, tell me what a wonderful thing it is for them to start talking to you again. And what does it mean when they stop talking to you? And what does it mean when they start talking to you? Yes, we have millions of people on YouTube and all over the internet. Television 24/7. We've devalued speech in that way. Devalued the miracle of speech in that way. Devalued the importance of speech in that way. The angel shows up and he could have done a ton of different things, but what he does is he talks. That should give us pause, right? He shows up and he has okay, let's get going, Mary. This is what we do is Jesus is risen from the dead. Here, I've got this new dance track that I put together. Let's dance. I'm sorry. If they haven't done it for 2,000 years in the history of Christianity, why should we be doing it now? That's an incredibly good question. What I'm doing now, strip away my microphone, take away my lights, take away the internet, I can still talk about Jesus, and that's the same thing that's been going on for 2,000 years. But if you take away my spinning discs and my laser lights, so maybe that has nothing to do with Christianity. It's not essential. I'll sit back down now. Sorry, folks. No, not. It needs to be said. Somebody needs to say it. So, the angel comes down and talks. We got like 2 minutes. 2 minutes. And they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy. It's kind of like when my first son was born. I left the hospital with fear and great joy. Oh, it's true. Because you're like, man, wow, that's cool. Oh, now, what are we going to do? One of my daughters just had her first child. And just thinking about that same, it just brings back that whole trip to the hospital, and I went out and bought some clothes for the child, and of course, knowing nothing about children and babies, and I bought some clothing, and I remember, and I took it to the hospital, and my wife was laughing because the baby fit in half the clothing that I bought. But we've got pictures, and it's like, oh, I didn't think it was that small, but he was, but he soon grew up into that, and now, of course, he's bigger than I am. So I started with optimism. Here, he should fit in this. Okay, we'll pick this up next week, and I'm glad you could join us this morning. I hope you can join us for worship this morning, and wonderful hymns and readings, and hope that you can take part. The service order is found on our website.